Oh, okay. Well, that was pretty good. So, hi everybody. Welcome. I know you guys have had quite a day already, and it only gets better from here. My name is Bill Gruskin. I'm a professor here at the journalism school. I used to be the academic dean, and I am no longer doing academic administration, which counts for the large, fat smile on my face. You've never really had fun as a manager until you oversee people who literally cannot be fired. I just want to recommend it. Wow, that's right. I have a lot more to say, but really I would take up all the time from our guests. So this is really one of the great events on the J School calendar all year. It's where we bring in the Hearst Digital Media Professional-in-Residence, and that's what we're doing tonight. You all heard the name Hearst, and that's because we're very grateful here at the J School to the Hearst Foundation, which has provided the support so we can bring this and another event together. Basically, every year we appoint a Hearst Digital Media Professional-in-Residence to participate in activities of the school and also to do 2 key lectures or presentations. Past honorees have been Mario Garcia, the famous news designer, Amanda Cox from the New York Times, Krishna Bharat, who invented Google News, Ken Lehrer, the venture capitalist, Brian Storm, Adrian Holovati, and a host of others. So to that great list of people, we had Kevin Delaney, who is a former colleague of mine when we were both at the Wall Street Journal, and we both had more hair, right? Kevin currently is the founding editor-in-chief, and co-president of Quartz, which is a wonderful business news site, which was launched by the Atlantic Media company almost 3 years ago, right? 2.5. I knew Kevin when he was a reporter and an editor at the Wall Street Journal. He had combat assignments like the Paris and San Francisco bureaus, covered small companies like Google and Facebook. And after he developed all that knowledge about digital media, he became managing editor of WSJ.com, the largest subscription news site in the world, as we used to call it. And he led many efforts there to expand the journal's digital readership. He also worked at Smart Money magazine. He's a graduate of Yale, member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and he was named Business Journalist of the Year in 2013. To his left is Lydia Polgreen, who is an alumna of this school, year 2000, class of 2000. She is currently Deputy International Editor for the New York Times, but has had many difficult assignments overseas and has done those with great skill and grace. She was the South Africa Bureau Chief. She was a correspondent for the Times in New Delhi. She was chief of the West Africa Bureau. And she's also done her chops in metro reporting, both at the New York Times as well as the Orlando Sentinel and the Albany Times-Union, which is where great journalists come from, right? And she began her career at the Washington Monthly. She has, as I said, she's an alumna of the J School, has a bachelor's from St. John's College, and is a recipient of both the George Polk Award in 2006 for her reporting from Sudan, as well as the 2008 Livingston Award for other coverage from Africa. And she is also known as a young global leader, according to the World Economic Forum, which is a whole lot for somebody who graduated from J School in 2000. So I'm going to turn this over to Kevin, and he's going to take care of it from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. I'm really very flattered to be here. This is the result of one of Bill's final acts in office here at Columbia. They were threatening to shut off his email, I think, as he was asking me last summer if I would agree to this Hearst Professional-in-Residence. And this, as he said, is the second of the parts of the presentation. I'm also really honored to be here with this really amazing group of people. I grew up in Queens. This is sort of group and the sort of forum that I dreamed of as a kid being able to speak to one day. So this is sort of a bit of a hometown dream come true for me. So what we're going to do today is I've been asked to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Quartz. So for about 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to walk through how we've been thinking about, in the 2.5 years since our launch, we've been thinking about this question of global readerships for quality content. And I'm relying on the patience of Lydia and you all to get through that. And then the two of us are going to jump into the issues together in conversation as well. The program will be followed by a drink. We're not able to reverse the order, but we're going to make you all earn it. So let's see if this works. Can you tell me what I need to... this? All right, well, while we're getting this up, so as Bill said, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for about 16 years, and 3 years ago I left. I went to China by myself for 2 weeks, which I'd recommend highly if you're ever leaving a job and want to clear your head. It's less being in China and more being on these long plane rides, kind of in between. That's incredibly clarifying. And I wound up in a small, totally empty loft on Spring Street with this project that had been given to me by the folks who own the Atlantic to start what would ultimately become Quartz. This is a loft with furniture. So when I was there was no furniture. So the founding thought experiment of what we were doing was at least partly, what would The Economist be if it was founded now and not in 1843? And this was out of great respect for The Economist, which has managed somehow over all of these decades to preserve incredible relevance. And these two covers, the second one is one of my favorites from over the years. So we had three core answers to this question, what would The Economist be? And they are, Quartz would be mobile and tablet first, because that's where all of the growth in news readership is, particularly if you're starting. It would be journalistic, and that felt like the core opportunity of what we're doing, to do something that wasn't cynical and over SEO'd, but actually do something of real substance. And in fact, it's just simply what we were most interested in doing. And then the third thing was that it would be global, and that's what we're going to talk about here today, what the global readership is for news. So our aspiration at Quartz's founding was to create a post-national news organization, or at least come as close as you possibly could. Our goal is to be both locally interesting and globally relevant, or globally interesting and locally relevant as well. And this is a departure from traditional media, which in most cases, for historical manufacturing and distribution reasons in large part, was defined by geography. You have the New Haven Register, the Times of London, USA Today. Even the international efforts were explicitly anchored in their home city or one of its thoroughfares, New York, the Wall Street. But it seemed pretty obvious that the most important dynamics of the new global economy operate without respect to national boundaries. These two stories from Quartz are small examples. I'll go to the second one. So most of you probably seen on Facebook photos of babies with blankets swaddled around them. This is like 60% of the content on Facebook on a good day. And these blankets are actually all pretty much the same blanket. There's this sort of ubiquitous blanket that every hospital, actually not just in the United States, but around the world, distributes. It's a white blanket with this sort of multicolored stripe around the side. You surely recognize it if you could see it even closer. Well, it turns out there's a really interesting global economic story. The blankets they're used around the world. They're produced by an Illinois healthcare supply company, and they're manufactured in Pakistan. And so we had a reporter who sort of traced this ubiquitous sort of icon of our digital lives that no one actually really knew the story of. And it turns out that it's representative of the global economy. So this sort of points to that trend. We're also convinced that there's a group of post-national readers who are ready consumers of coverage that obsessively identified and tracked the governing phenomena of the new global economy. The name Quartz was partly an attempt to signal our global view. Quartz, the mineral, is found everywhere in the world. I think it's the second most common substance. And it turns out no one asks me where the name comes from anymore. We sort of had the first snarky article about it out of the way, and then it sort of lives on without comment somehow, miraculously. And the key thing was to hire a staff of journalists who had deep experience of the world. So we had a relatively small founding team. This is 2.5 years in, but our founding team of journalists was about 18 people, and collectively they spoke close to 20 languages and had reported from 115 different countries. Today, about 1/3 of our roughly 40 journalists are outside of the US, and over 40% of Quartz's 10 million monthly readers come from outside the US. The demographic data that we can glean supports this idea of a post-national reader. Less than a year ago, we launched Quartz India, an edition that's automatically shown to readers who are located in India using geo-targeting technology. You can also go to it, qz.com/India, and it includes a greater density of articles that are about India. We now have 5 journalists who are writing exclusively for Quartz in India about India through a partnership that we have there. The content that they produce has about 1.5 million readers each month now, from close to nothing when we started under a year ago. In about a month, we plan to launch Quartz Africa, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and coverage of the Africa of innovation. So there's Africa of resources, which has traditionally been covered really well. We feel like there's an opportunity to provide quality coverage of the Africa of innovation. Some of the reasons for that are here, and some of the Quartz coverage that we've done already about Africa is on the right side of the screen. Interestingly, our data show that articles about India are currently among the most popular articles among readers in Africa. This speaks to this sort of the new global economy that's not contained by a city or a country. Our expectation is that in all these places, many of our readers will be accessing Quartz on mobile devices. This is a country-by-country breakdown of the time people spend on mobile versus desktop. And if you look, some of the places that skew most heavily towards mobile are Kenya, Nigeria, Thailand, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Germany, Japan. This is where the whole world is heading, and where some of these countries are actually that we're trying to serve even better, are at the vanguard. And our content is optimized for mobile. It tends to be very visual. Our journalists created 3,800 charts last year using a tool called Chart Builder that we built in our newsroom, and actually open source. A lot of other news organizations are using it. And our articles are generally either short or long. This is probably too hard to explain quickly, but this chart is one way. We call it the Quartz curve. And the idea is that the things on the left and the right at the high ends of the curve are what people read. And it turns out that people read short stuff that's very focused and shareable and to the point, doesn't waste their time. They'll actually read long things as well, where there's a payoff for the reader in terms of narrative, reporting, analysis. The cover stories of the Atlantic magazine are 10,000 words long most months. And those are incredibly popular digitally, which I think is encouraging for those of us who are rooting for quality content in this digital world. So writing with voice is one of the challenges of post-national news coverage from an editorial perspective. Our style guide has this is an excerpt from our style guide, which is relevant to this. It has a section strongly discouraging the use of any sports metaphors. It points out the problem with using words like foreign and abroad when writing for a global readership. To be honest, at times it feels somewhat awkward to always insert the word US, or for our writers in India to specify things, but we feel it's important to try and anchor our coverage less in a specific place, or when we're trying to address a readership that's not particularly anchored in that place. A broader question is how to write things that are sophisticated and detailed enough for readers locally while being interesting and relevant to users globally. This is an ongoing challenge. It's one that we're working through in India. It's one that we anticipate in Africa as well. But we've found that smart coverage can generally bridge and reach both of those readerships. So one example is coverage written by a reporter, Gwyn Guilford, who lived in China for a long time. And it was about the Hong Kong umbrella protest movement last year. She noted, this is the article, she noted that the understandings of Cantonese and Mandarin speakers of the Chinese characters for the movement were quite different. So for the Chinese, it's sort of for Mandarin-speaking mainland Chinese, the characters convey something that's a little bit sort of vague and I think has some connection to an umbrella. Whereas for the Hong Kong Cantonese, it actually was much more forceful, and it was effectively convey the idea of striking back against the Hong Kong chief executive. So readers in Hong Kong cited it to me as really insightful coverage, and we know from our overall readership that it was actually very popular as well. So last challenge, and I think Kara and Walt, I understand, sort of hashed through this a little bit, is this question of advertising. So without going into in greater detail, I can tell you that our experience of the first 3 years, 2.5 years of Quartz, is that a business model anchored in advertising can actually work. We have strong conviction that this is something. We also do events, and eventually we'll do paid content of some sort or other when it feels like the right thing to do. But when you're looking at and this is an example of an advertisement that we run. We run non-standard, non-IAB advertising, which might explain why we're able to, for those of you deeply in the industry, we're able to sidestep the sort of the threat of programmatic advertising, which is just commodifying publishing sites for advertising at scale. But we have advertising that's specifically sold against our readership in the UK, India, Africa, and other places. But we still get advertisers who want to advertise just to readers in the US who are using desktop computers. And that's the sort of most easily accessible pot of money. It's a really significant pot of money. So if you're trying to reach post-national readers, you're trying to have a publication, a digital publication that truly takes advantage of the opportunities of global global economy, and the people who are providing the bulk of your revenue are telling you they want US users on desktop devices. It's a bit of a juggling act, which so far seems manageable, but frankly speaking, it's something that we think about. So I want to briefly end on a personal note, and I'm going to show you what our office looks like today. It looks very messy there, actually. And these are joint offices we have off Union Square with The Atlantic. So I started working for my college newspaper at age 18. I went to Yale. I've been a journalist since. There have been moments where, amid the collapse of metro newspapers, when it's been difficult to have conviction that the career of the journalist is one with much of a future. The reason I think that many of us persevere, and why some former colleagues are actually coming back to the profession, which is incredibly heartening, and certainly why I've been working so hard is to try to ensure that quality journalism thrives in our digital world. And the thing that does seem to make a difference is a willingness to experiment, to have conviction, to try things, to leave a 16-year career at the Wall Street Journal for something where there's no furniture when you show up on your first day. There's a very famous Lincoln quote, which you can probably recite along me, but it is super relevant to these discussions. Lincoln said in his address to Congress, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion." The important part, as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country, or at least our journalism. The evidence of the past few years is encouraging. A number of digital news organizations have become more like traditional news organizations in the ambition and the excellence of their reporting. And traditional news organizations are becoming more digitally savvy. They're doing things like having developers sit alongside the journalists in the newsroom for the first time. There's as much a place as ever in news organizations for individuals who are both journalists and entrepreneurs. So we have someone who fits that category who's been waiting very patiently here. And journalists who are also entrepreneurs aren't always the most patient people, fortunately. So I'm going to step aside from here and leave you with that image of our newsroom. And Lydia and I are going to talk for a little bit. There will be time for questions, so please, we're counting on you to be part of this discussion. So we're going to dive back into some of the things that we talked about, but I want to just, so you have a long career at the Times. You're working on this really interesting project that's directly connected to the theme. Can you tell everybody about how you're spending your day?
Sure. The New York Times, at one point in its history, went from being a metropolitan newspaper for people who live in New York City to being a national newspaper, and that was enabled by our ability to electronically transmit our pages all around different places and have these distribution networks in California and Chicago, and so what happened when we went national is, I mean, essentially it saved the company. We wouldn't have survived, I don't think, if we hadn't expanded our audience in that way. And what's really exciting about this moment that we're living in right now is that the New York Times has a bigger audience than it ever has in its history. I was a high school student in Ghana when the government there, the president at the time, Jerry Rawlings, took off his uniform. He was a flight lieutenant who had ruled as a military dictator and decided to become decided to run for office. And I was, I don't know, I think maybe in 9th grade, and I was witnessing these amazing, momentous events. But I lived in a house that didn't have a telephone because there were no telephones in that neighborhood, and the waiting list to get one was like 10 years long. So I imagine like a New York Times reporter going to Ghana to cover the election that ultimately brought Jerry Rawlings to legitimate power and brought democracy to this great African country. And the story that journalist wrote, like the only way that I, as a high school student, ever would have read it would have been maybe months later, clipped out and put into the library. So when I went later as a correspondent to Ghana, and I saw this extraordinary revolution of people being able to read the stories that I wrote and tell me that they thought they were great, or tell me that they thought they were terrible. It was just clear to me that we were living in this extraordinary moment of transformation. And just as there was a whole generation of people who never experienced having a home phone and went straight to mobile, there is now going to be this generation of people who never experienced desktop internet and go directly to the mobile web, and for whom the web will be a very intimate experience of something that you carry around in your pocket, which to me as a teenager living in Ghana, where we had to crowd into a tiny booth to call my grandparents on Christmas, was unimaginable that you would be carrying around in your pocket a computer that could let you connect with anyone in the world. Was just unimaginable. So this has sort of been my personal life trajectory, is seeing the fulfillment of this amazing dream. So it's sort of in that spirit, I think, that I look at the Globe and think, the New York Times currently has around 60 million readers every month. About a third of them are from outside the United States. Looking at taking Facebook as a proxy, there are maybe 500 million people in the world who are on Facebook and who are over the age of 18 and are either in college or college educated. I think all of those people are potential readers of the New York Times. So my job is to figure out, how do we get them to read the New York Times? What kind of stories do they want to read from the New York Times? What do they love? What are they not interested in? What can we stop doing? And I think that as a legacy news organization, our orientation has always been, here you go, here's the breadth and majesty that is the New York Times. It used to be a newspaper, but now it's 300 or 400 URLs. Have at it. But I think the future lies, not just for our global audience, but for our audience domestically as well, in figuring out what are the 20 stories that someone really wants to read. And it's not going to be the same 20 stories for every person, but I believe that the real value that the New York Times can provide to any reader anywhere is we can give you a shared experience telling you what really matters in the world based on what we know about the world, and a personalized experience based on what we know about you. So that's sort of the guiding philosophy of what I'm doing. So it's sort of a long-winded way of saying we're basically trying to figure out, how do we build a broad international audience for the New York Times? And language is one of the levers that you can pull in doing that, but there are lots of others.
Well, so how do you do that? So you're talking about trying to understand what readers across 180-something countries want from the New York Times. Is this big data Facebook problem, or what's your?
It's partly that. I mean, we're doing a lot of A/B testing on Facebook. Our current focus is largely around Latin America, so we're pushing stories out and testing things like, how important is language? What kind of stories do we need to translate? Does every story need to be translated, or are there only certain stories that need to be translated in order to find a large audience? And without getting too much into the details, because some of my bosses haven't heard them yet. I'll say that the results are surprising. I see language as a form of audience development. It's a way of telling to someone, this story is for you. We didn't just write it and throw it up on the web and say, maybe you'll stumble across it or not. It's a story that we wrote that we thought you'd like. So I see language as a powerful tool, whether or not it's more effective in deepening whether it's more effective in getting you a bigger audience, but it's also a way of communicating to an audience that you value them. So that's sort of one part of it. We're doing a lot of A/B testing to sort of figure out what catches on, what do people really, really value. Our bedrock proposition is always that the New York Times will provide some kind of a shared experience that will tell you, that will be a snapshot of the world, like the page one experience, but everything else is kind of up for grabs.
So one of the things that we've been thinking about as we've expanded is the sort of experience or the background of the journalists who are reporting on a specific place. And so in India specifically, we have 5 journalists who work for them. All 5 of them are Indian nationals. And that's really important to us as we're staffing up for Africa. One of the reporters is a Chinese-American Mandarin speaker who is terrifically well placed to cover the story of China and Asia and Africa. So, but our expectation is that everyone else will actually be nationals of the sub-Saharan Africa and countries where we're present. And one question I have, and in our experience, like there are established narratives about specific countries, and it's really hard as an expat journalist to come into a country and have a sophisticated view that goes contrary to those narratives. I was based in Paris for 6 years for the Wall Street Journal, where there are lots of incredibly false narratives about how rude the French are and things like that. They're not actually that rude, but it feels to us like it's really important to have sort of local journalists as opposed to parachuted in expat journalists. As I'm listening to you talk, it seems to me that that's probably one of the ways in which your project could be problematic or revolutionary for the New York Times.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that we're trying to sort of figure out. I mean, there's 2 ways to think about it, right? The New York Times already produces a lot of journalism that would be of interest to someone anywhere in the world, right? So, let's say I'm targeting an audience in Mexico. Our coverage of technology, of the fine arts, of popular culture, we do a lot of writing about, and just because I've been testing a lot of these, sex and relationships. There are certain kinds of stories that are just deeply universal. I mean, the Oliver Sacks op-ed about learning that he had terminal cancer. You could translate that into any language and push it out to any audience because death is, as we all know, a universal human experience. So I think there's an element of that a lot of the sort of work that we're doing around this is figuring out what are we already doing? What's the journalism that we're doing that has broad appeal, and how can we do more of it? In terms of looking at localized content, like stories that would be particularly focused on that market, my sense is that the local press in those places is where people turn for coverage of those places. They'll turn to the New York Times if we have a really major investigative story, if we have some sort of special access, or particularly illuminating insight. And that is often something that comes as a result of a collaboration between local journalists and the correspondent from the Times. So we're starting from the point of saying, like, we want to try and figure out what is it that we're already producing that is of value, and then grow from there, rather than, because we do have correspondents in these places, and we, I think, find value, because, again, we're thinking that a reader in Mexico is just as interested in the interpretive take of a New York Times journalist writing in China as a reader in the U.S. would be, right? So, so we see ourselves as kind of having that, and so similarly, I would say, like, one of the things I'd love to do is an experiment that might be really interesting is, what if we had a correspondent for the New York Times who was covering the 2016 election for an audience outside of the United States? You know, taking that kind of interpretive approach and that stand-back approach.
In the United States, writing for readers outside, or outside looking in?
No, in the United States
Yeah.
and writing. I mean, there's always been this, like, if you're a foreign correspondent, they say, come and be a foreign correspondent in the U.S., cover the American South. But, you know, you're still chasing tornadoes because, like, that's what we do, right, as a foreign correspondent. But I do think that there's a real value in that interpretive approach. And that interpretive approach, I think, often comes from an outsider.
And I think there are actually interesting phenomena. So when I was at the Wall Street Journal, we launched a Japanese language blog. And it turns out that there was a huge Japanese readership interest in what the Wall Street Journal thought Japan was about. Part of it was that there were moments, including during Fukushima, when it was really hard or untried or for the domestic press to actually cover some of the more thorny sort of aspects of it. But part of it was also just like, what do these Americans make of us when they like come over here and write about our country? So there's some interesting pockets of that. One question I have for you is, what is the goal for the New York Times? Is this $8 a month mobile app subscriptions for the New York Times? What is the business or other imperative that's driving them to put one of their most talented journalists on a project like this?
Well, thank you. I mean, my goal and my objectives are just to build audience. I think that we have, I think the one dictum that remains true is that you need to have an audience before you think about how to monetize it. And that in part has informed my approach, right? I mean, think about already existing content with our already existing staff that we can make more appealing, either through audience development, through packaging, through translating, and sort of begin to build an audience that way. And as you build that audience, you might find, oh, you know, we really need an investigative reporter in, you know, Latin America. Or we might find that, you know, upshot stories do really well, but we're not doing enough global stuff. So let's add a global position to the upshot. Or let's add that, you know, internationally focused person covering the presidential election. I mean, by the way, I think those kinds of stories about the presidential election would actually be really popular with an audience in the United States. But I mean, you mentioned The Economist, and I think all of us are inspired by The Economist, right? Because it does do such an amazing job of having an interpretive approach to covering the world without having a specific. And the advantage they have is they do have a specific ideological point of view, but it's very much global. So. So I think that's our thinking.
I mean, there are two interesting things that you just said to me. One is that you're about building audience. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like there's a specific revenue, either advertising or subscription, undercurrent to that, or maybe there is and you just didn't mention.
No.
Okay.
Not at the
second
moment.
thing is that you said that the journalism, the deployment of staff in the newsroom of the New York Times downtown or Midtown and elsewhere in the world could be dictated by what readers in Latin America or elsewhere could be.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the potential is huge, right? I mean, if there is, you know, if we reach a point where we're 50-50 global and U.S. audience, and I mean, it's not rocket science, there are more people outside of the United States than there are in it, then, you know, suddenly we could find that, you know, if there is a major art touring exhibition that opens at the Tate before it comes to MoMA, the most important review that we do is going to be the one when it opens at the Tate, right? So a lot of things really have to change. I mean, I looked with envy at your style guide. You know, I would love to be able to make those kinds of changes. I mean, we've already made some adjustments. I mean, it used to be de rigueur for foreign correspondents to describe countries by the size of a U.S. state, you know? And I mean, what better way could you tell somebody who lives in Belgium that you don't give a damn about them than by saying like, oh, the size of Texas, you know, or the size of Rhode Island. I mean, Texas is not so bad because like at least Texas is like, it's big, you know? Like the size of Illinois, I mean, I have no idea how big Illinois is. You know? So I mean, I think being global means a fairly major shift in our emphasis and priorities as a newsroom. And so you're going to stop doing a lot of things and really, you really have to think about reallocating your editorial resources in a way that serves where your biggest audience is.
And the distribution platform is Facebook?
Well, I mean, I think the distribution platform is wherever readers are, right? I mean, I think that we find some readers on Facebook, but, you know, there's email, there's Twitter, there's Line, there's WeChat, if the Chinese ever decide to like us again. We need to be wherever readers are. So I think there are a million different ways that we can get to people. I mean, the great thing is like, you know, it used to be that if we wanted to reach an audience outside of the United States, we would have to take our content and go to somebody who had a platform and say, let's make a deal, we'll give you our content if you publish it, you know. We don't need that anymore, you know. I mean, and I should
It was pretty good revenue from what I understood.
Well, but I mean, it's I mean, think about it this way, right? You know, and this is a reminder that this kind of disruption is not just for, you know, old fogey companies like ours. You know, Netflix had a very successful business mailing DVDs to people's houses. You know, they knew that, and that made a lot of revenue for them, and I think continues to make a fair bit of revenue. But they knew that streaming was coming, right? So I think what Netflix did was they said, we're going to continue to make a huge amount of revenue off this, but we're going to like segment it, put it over here, and let it run on autopilot until we squeeze every last drop of money out of it. But we're going to put our best and smartest people over here where we think the future is going, which is streaming, right? And so I think that legacy news organizations are in exactly that same position where we have a huge amount of revenue coming from this, but we really need to put all of our best people into figuring out what's next.
In some ways, it seems like the UK publications are been better than the US publications in terms of building up really significant readerships. The one, you know, I say it without comment, the Mail Online is, you know, has an incredible readership in a foreign market for them, which is us.
Yes.
Are they at all, do you think about the UK, the Guardian, the Telegraph?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously I'm an admirer of the Guardian. I'm pretty excited to see what Kath Viner does when she takes over. She's obviously had a lot of experience in this area. I think the Guardian, again, with a slightly more kind of ideological point of view, they take on the issues that they think are the winning issues for them with the audience that they're seeking, which I think is a really effective way to connect with people. And there's like a real gap in the marketplace for that in the United States, in particular. You know, in Australia, the story is a little bit different, right? I mean, I think there's been a kind of, whether or not Murdoch still owns any papers, there's been this kind of Murdochization of the news business there. So there really is a kind of hunger for something quality. But I think that these British news organizations, particularly the Daily Mail, have been incredibly aggressive at taking sort of their brand and whatever their idea is and sort of pushing it out into a lot of different places. But there are others who are doing it really successfully as well. I mean, El País has an extraordinarily successful in terms of audience business in Latin America, both in Brazil and in Spanish-speaking Latin America. And, I think that's like a very far-seeing thing. Spain is a very small country, and ultimately, where are you going to go? And when I traveled down in Latin America, people often said to me, "Oh, you guys are like El País. That's who we look to for culture coverage." And the great thing for us is we're sort of complementary to them, right? They come from a more European perspective. but you need to know what you're about, right? I mean, I think that that's the thing, is you need to have a very clear sense, who is your user? You know, who's the person that you're trying to, and what job are you doing for them? You know, that's what you need to figure out.
We're going to take questions in just a minute. I want to ask Lydia one last question, but if you want, there is a microphone, I think, there. If you have a question, I think we're asking people to step to the microphone. The last question I have is a little bit around this personalization. And so one of the publications that I was looking at as 3 years ago, we were trying to figure out what Quartz could be, was Monocle. So some of you probably know this. It's a British, London-based, but pretty international publication that's about lots of things. What I always found really interesting about Monocle is their assumption that you were a citizen of the global something, and that there could be an article on Japanese bookstore design that was followed by an article which was a Q&A with the ports minister of Denmark or something like that. They sort of fetishize Denmark, Scandinavia, and Japan. So that actually probably is one of the things. But the presumption, and it's not something that I felt like U.S. newspapers are traditionally have tried to contextualize and put the foreign coverage, in its own section, because people might not be interested in. People who are interested in news about New York might not be interested in news about Japan or Denmark or these other places. So I guess the question, maybe you can react to that, but the question is a little bit around the assumptions you make about your readers' interest in the world and the extent to which you actually do or don't want to personalize things for them.
Yeah, it's a huge and very great question that we're facing right now and wrestling with. How do you preserve some serendipity in the experience? How do you, and also, what does personalization really mean? And how are things related to each other? Because I think, we all think about these, incredibly sophisticated algorithms that at the end of the day are dumber than an editor. I mean, one of the most gratifying things that I've found is that A/B testing has confirmed my godlike abilities to predict what people like. Like I really do know. They're not really godlike, but it's one of my colleagues, Ian Fisher, has a great saying. He says that editors are the judge and jury, but data is the court of appeals. And I think that that's a useful way to think about it. That you need to start with human judgment and then move on. I mean, I look at look at the the New York Times Magazine, for example. And magazines are like a great place for really kind of figuring out like where that magic is, that of just putting together just the right things. That you have an issue about the world that's got Gary Steingart in a hotel room, watching Russian TV, and then you've got a piece about Airbnb hosts in Japan, and some mind has sort of decided that these are the things you need to know. So I think
what's interesting is that very few readers actually experience that mix.
That's what I was coming to.
The articles are finding a readership, and the readership is probably different for both.
Totally. So, I mean, the New York Times is traditionally, it organized itself bureaucratically around the form of the product that they produce, right? Which is a newspaper, which needs sections. And so you have the front page where you can kind of billboard a few things, and then you turn the page and it's like, okay, world and national, and everything is divided up. And because we were bureaucratically organized that way, when we went to digital, we just sort of adopted that and kept it. And so, the Metro section, the international section, and the national section all do these stories called journals. And they're all stories that are designed to transport you to a place. And if I'm a reader in Brussels, I'd probably be just as interested in a journal about Ouagadougou as I would be as one about Howard Beach. So the user doesn't really experience the story as a foreign story. They experience it in a completely different way. community. So I think in terms of two buckets, right? There's the stuff you need to know, and there's the stuff you like, you know? And those will be things that'll be in one bucket for one person, will be in the other bucket for another person. But that's how I think about personalization. It's less about, you know, I know that you read a story about baseball, therefore I'm going to only send you. But it's more about sort of thinking in a deeper and more broad way about putting things into which bucket.
Great. Okay, we're going to switch to questions. Can I ask everybody just to say your name and anything else relevant about yourself?
Steve Ross, class of 70. The most frustrating thing about the New York Times, which I consider a phenomenal source, I read it every day online, but basically, although you're expanding the comments allowable, it's still very, very low, and you actively, not you, but the paper actively discourages the most knowledgeable comments, because if you catch the Times in an error, excuse the Boston accent, you're taken out of the comment stream, and maybe the Times will run a correction. And if the Times does run a correction, it doesn't even credit the person who pointed out the error, and this drives people crazy. I was particularly frustrated on Monday. The Times editorial page, Times editorial, quoted an article in my magazine and didn't allow comments. you know?
All right, Lydia,
It's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, we are a community of commenters is one of the most important and valuable assets that the Times has. And, you know, we are working really hard to expand our ability to moderate comments, because one of the things that makes our comments so great is that they are moderated and therefore not just a total free-for-all. I do think that, I love your idea of crediting the person who suggested a correction, because I think that's brilliant. I'm going to pass that on to the community team. So, and repeat your name so I'll know who to credit it to.
Steve Ross. But I come back, is you're still only allowing comments on about 40, because you can't possibly moderate it all.
Yeah.
And people from all over the world around, you can't possibly moderate that. And so the question then is, why bother for a wide range of articles?
I think we've noted your comment.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Thanks for coming. Ruthvish Devashai, current class, Master of Science. You guys were talking about revenue models, and in both cases it seems like, without sounding really flip or anything like that, it's coming from the old rich Americans. In example, for Quartz, it's coming through your advertisement in America. For Times, you gave an example of Netflix, like DVD distribution network. So as the demographic changes, these people are going to eventually die, and you know, how do you?
Who's going to die?
I mean, the rich old Americans, basically. How do you anticipate the change in revenue models, and how are you going to adapt to the change of demographics?
So just to start from Quartz's perspective, like there is actually, in the demographics of our readership, support that there is this post-national group of business professionals who live around the world who are actually not, for the most part, American. This is a growing group of people. The median age of our reader is 43. They work in industries like finance and tech and media and consulting and law, and they are people who buy luxury cars, and they could conceivably buy a Rolex watch or consult with a financial advisor from one of the firms. These are not people who live in the U.S. who actually have the ability to do that. Because of the type of content we're writing, that we're targeting a business readership, and that is ultimately a global. And I think the assumption that the old, the white rich Americans are going to go away and no one is going to be in their place is not an assumption that I share, because already, a big part of our global professional, pretty affluent readership is actually not white rich Americans, and that portion of them is growing faster, definitely, than the We don't break it down demographically, just to be really clear, between white rich Americans and others. But if we were to look at that data,
That's funny, we do.
somehow, if we were able to do that, I'm sure that that would be the case.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the whole reason that the Times is interested in a global expansion is that we see, once we've built a larger audience in particular markets, we see an opportunity there. So to me, there's no question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Benjamin Moe at GS, Columbia student. So I've been fascinated by some of the features the New York Times have been doing, which are kind of immersive journalism, combining video, data visualization, audio. For example, one of them, which was really groundbreaking for me, was Snowfall, which is it's become famous at this point. And I was wondering, first, how feasible is it to do that? I mean, how long does it take to put together a story like that? Do you need a team of like 5 programmers and 2 videographers and 3 journalists? How does that fit into the normal cycle of a newsroom? And then second, how do you see those figuring into the future of the New York Times? Because for me as an online reader, those are the stories that I'm most attracted to. As you said, it's like the Atlantic features. They're the ones that reward me sitting down for 20 minutes because they hold my attention. And so how do you see those figuring into the future and changing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most gratifying things that we're learning is that our most ambitious journalism is what people most want to read. I mean, that's like awesome news, right? And I think of it like CD. Think about a CD that you would buy. Like when you're buying a CD, it's an album. It's sort of got a narrative to it, and it's like a newspaper, right? I mean, certain pages of.
Are you still buying CDs?
No, well, of course not. Just stay with me here. I'll get to it. But like now, I mean, basically, so you could have a couple of songs on a CD that were like kind of filler, this is just like to set the mood until like we get to the next really great song. But I think we're living in an era now where like every song needs to be a banger. You can't have any duds on your album, basically, and you design our Metro editor says about the print product that every page should be a dress page, meaning like every page should have great reads on it. There's no more like, we have a 500, we have a gutter or a deck, as they call them in the print business. We need to fill it with something. Everything needs to earn its keep, So I think you're going to continue to see us, doing that kind of like deep immersive storytelling. We've gotten a lot better than we used to be at doing those kinds of things quickly. Snowfall took forever. Now we can do and we have a variety of templates to do those kinds of stories much more easily. And the truth is, Medium and other organizations have shown that really anybody can do a nice full bleed layout. It's not rocket science. I think I really admire what Quartz has done with Chart Builder and empowering reporters to make their own charts so that data visualization becomes part of everybody's storytelling toolkit, which I think is great. But at the same time, the really signature work that the graphics department of the New York Times does, it's going to continue to be bespoke, designed things that will really blow your mind. I mean, whether it's the amazing graphic that we had about missing black men that ran on the top of the homepage for much of the day a few days ago, or there's the spot the ball quiz that we had for the World Cup. Those things are built by hand by developers and designers who work hand in hand, and sometimes they're developer designers who work together. So those are really hard to build. Another thing that I think has been really exciting is that we've really we used to basically, when Snowfall was built, nobody thought, how's this going to work on a mobile phone? It's it was just a regular news story on a mobile phone. Nobody really thought about it. But the most recent there was the review of the new Whitney on the phone was
great.
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, so we're now seeing every single thing being designed with a flawless mobile experience, and in fact, in many ways, the mobile experience is the best experience. It opens up all kinds of great possibilities. I mean, over the summer. during the Ebola crisis, we had one of our photographers do a series of portraits in one of the Ebola wards. And traditionally, we don't do a lot of vertical shots because they just don't work as well, either in print or in the. But this was vertical after vertical, which is perfect on a phone. And so that series of photos was really like a better experience on mobile than it was anywhere else. So it's probably a longer question, the answer than needed, but it's an exciting area where I think there's like a lot of stuff going on.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pete?
Yeah, hey, Pete Leiden, class of 85, 30 years here. I have a little new media company in San Francisco. One of the things that's interesting is that people that came to this school over the years have often come to make a difference, you know, to kind of make an impact, to really challenge the powerful, to drive change. And I think in the old media, there was always a way that you could force that front page story that everyone would have to hit, or the lead story on television or something. And I'm interested in the way you view this new medium. Like, how does that translate in a world where it's very personalized and people just want what they want? And they're not really being forced into maybe some hard stories that they really don't want to have to force themselves, but they have to. And two, given it's global, how do you deal with 186 different political systems, autocracies, you know, democracies? I mean, how do you drive agendas? Or is that side of journalism kind of you have to let go of both those sides in this new media field? I'd be curious on your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think your observation is really accurate. Like, we don't think of Quartz's homepage is visited, you know, represents 10% of our traffic. People actually, the articles see the headlines in their feeds. And so our hope is that an article finds its readership on a social network, or someone emails it to a friend, or however these things get around. I think that, you know, I'm trying to figure out if I truly believe this, but let me try it out, and then you guys take it easy on me. But I think that the requirement now is that something be really important, but actually, like, even more urgent from the journalist's perspective, is that something not only be really important, but be really interesting. And so as there's lots of, like, I worked for the Wall Street Journal for years and wrote hundreds and hundreds of stories. And, in looking back, like, some of them were lazy. Like, I knew they were important, but I probably didn't work as hard as I could have to convey to readers that this was an important story, but actually should be interesting to them as well. And so I think one of the things that we try to do is to write stories that are at the intersection of what's important and what is interesting. And if something's really important, we try and push ourselves to make it as interesting as possible. And there are ways to do that are not cat photos and superficially presenting things. The great example, the most popular story in Atlantic media history, I believe, is a 10,000-word cover story on ISIS, which is a really wonky story on a topic that had been written about for months and months and months. But it was actually a really excellent story. I think that story falls in the category of what you're talking about, Pete. And it turns out that if you do really excellent work on a topic, you can actually get millions and millions and millions of readers to do it. What's interesting about this story is that there were many more visits than there were people for the story when you look at the data. And it turns out the story was so long that people are actually starting to read it, and they were actually coming back, presumably to finish, or at least consume a few thousand more words of the story. So I think from the perspective of your question, it's really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that, I mean, when I looked at the list of the top 20 stories of 2014, Ebola, top in terms of traffic, stories about Ebola, a story about the hostages who were beheaded by ISIS. I mean, it was not fluff, I mean, we'd like to think everything we do is like super high quality, but, it was not as if people were only like reading modern love columns. People read our most ambitious and best journalism.
And as far as many jurisdictions, it's like, I don't know, like we try and find the stories that are, and dig into them in a way wherever they are. But you're right, there are many jurisdictions and bad guys in the world, and training your sights on the baddest of the bad guys is an endeavor, that's important and ongoing.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be the kind of bad guy and limit it to 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask one of them.
He's the baddest of the bad.
Oh, man, that's a cold move.
I'm a cold man. Are striped socks a requirement for digital media? Okay, so that was my question.
Let's see, can we see your socks, Bill?
Well, it just shows. I work at Bloomberg, so
Yeah.
I can't wait till that goes out on Twitter. Okay, so we're going to allow one more question, and then you guys will join us in the reception, I hope. And so then you can agglomerate around them. So, and I'll let you guys fight it out.
Thank you. Mike Tokar's currently enrolled here. You said you think some of the best political coverage, interpretive political coverage, comes from outsiders. What did you mean by outsiders?
Oh, I was just saying that I thought that that covering that it would be really interesting to have an American news organization cover the 2016 election for an audience, explicitly for an audience outside the United States.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think I was saying that I mean, I do think that there's a lot of great reporting by outsiders. I mean, I love to read Ed Luce on politics, on U.S. politics,
Sure.
and the FT, for example, and I'd read Ed Luce on anything really, but so economist coverage of U.S. politics. I just meant that the appetite for like deep in the weeds coverage of American politics is ravenous here, but I think that if we're going to serve a global audience, we need to take a step back and help them understand American in the way that an American audience might want to understand Russia or China. So
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
So we're going to, as Bill said, that's it. Thank you all. It's an honor
Thanks.
to be part of the